Mind Deconstructed, Mental Health and Wellness with Dr. Kaz and George.
The statements of Dr. Kaz and George are not a substitute for medical care, and our opinions are our own. If you are experiencing a mental health emergency, please seek assistance from a professional in your area.
You can contact us via Twitter at Mind Deconstruct. I'm your host, George. With me is Dr. Kaz. Dr. Kaz Nelson is an American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology certified psychiatrist, licensed to practice medicine in the state of Minnesota, and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota Medical School. On today's episode, what's the deal with depression? Is it real? So, Dr. Kaz, depression. There's been a bit of a story going on out there about Andrew Tate. He's a light heavyweight kickboxing world champion, and he's been tweeting, which is always a good thing. But his tweets seem to indicate that he doesn't believe that depression is real. He specifically says, depression isn't real. You feel sad, you move on. You will always be depressed if your life is depressing. Change it. Thread. His point maybe is people get sad if you wallow in it. You're going to be sad.
Yeah. It's hard for me to really understand the point of what he meant in that tweet. On the surface, it hits me pretty hard, knowing thousands, perhaps hundreds or thousands of people who have suffered with depression and found it very difficult and debilitating and not easy to fix. So that's my bias right there. We'll get that out of the way at the beginning of our conversation. He does offer other tweets. There's a lot of back and forth with people who are calling him out on this statement and looking for some further insights. And basically, he's saying if you set your mind right and work out a lot, do physical exercise, manage your stress and your mood that way, you shouldn't be taken down by something like depression.
So let's get into it right away. What is depression?
Depression is a medical and psychiatric illness. Its full name would be called major depressive disorder. It's considered illness of the mood, and it really impacts people very seriously. It's different than feeling sad. It's different than feeling demoralized. It's different than feeling disappointed. Of course, all those emotions might go into somebody who has depression, but it's real and it's serious and it's a disorder. It's not a passing mood state.
You kind of said this already, but it's a mental illness?
Yes.
What does it mean that it's a mental illness? It's diagnosable?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. And of course, I'm sure the diagnostic criteria that we have may be imperfect. I always give that disclaimer because it's hard to say if our book of diagnostic criteria is absolutely correct, but the consensus of people who study this and work with people who have depression all the time, they found several criteria in order to meet diagnosis for depression. And it includes feeling very sad, feeling a lack of motivation. It impacts your drive to do things that you normally enjoy, like hobbies or sex, or even it could increase or decrease your appetite. So there's physical symptoms to the body. Sometimes your thinking can be slowed down. Your movement can even be slowed down. So it's a mind-body issue that causes significant dysfunction. It's very different than feeling temporarily sad.
Playing the little bit of the devil's advocate, one of the issues he brings up is the pharmaceutical industry and saying that the depression is 10,000% overprescribed. I'm not thinking he's got any studies to back that up, but what sort of medications are used to treat depression and how widespread is that treatment?
I think it's an important question, right? We want to make sure that conditions are real and not just, created so that a large corporation can profit over the fact that it's being diagnosed. And we do have an issue with precision in diagnosis in mental health care, and sometimes there are misdiagnoses in people. And I guess we could probably say the same thing happens in general medical care as well. So we're always working to be better and more accurate at diagnosing things. But the fact that medications do help with this disorder is sort of besides the point. There's a lot of things that treat depression. Sometimes medication can treat depression, sometimes it's other things. And so there is a reason to believe that more than one thing could treat depression. And I think Andrew Tate sort of makes that point. He says, if you just exercise, then you wouldn't have depression. And I think that's a completely not universally correct statement. There's many, many exceptions to that. But the truth is doing things like exercise or nutrition can help treat mild to moderate depression. And so there's lots of ways to treat depression, and it's not just a figment of a pharmaceutical industry.
I mean, I can see his point in some ways. Like some people with mild to moderate depression probably do work through it in time. Hopefully they have supports.
Right.
Is there more than one type of depression?
Yeah, there probably are some categories or different types of depression. And then certainly there are types of depression that are complicated or very severe. Sometimes people have a severe depression that might also come along with post-traumatic stress disorder or substance abuse or obsessive compulsive disorder or an eating disorder. And those are certainly complicated and difficult to treat and oftentimes require multiple approaches in order to lead to management of those illnesses. But there are mild or moderate forms of depression that respond to a whole range of things. And so every now and then an article will come out and say something like, oh, nature walks treat depression. And for mild to moderate depression, that's probably true because basically anything that you're doing proactively to seek wellness and manage stress can really have an impact on mild to moderate depression. But I also get a little bit nervous when I see those articles come out because if somebody has a moderate or severe depression or a complicated depression, you could walk for 10,000 miles in a park and it still wouldn't get better. You need a broader approach, and sometimes that includes biological interventions like medication or even in some very, very severe cases, electroconvulsive therapy. So it is a complicated and nuanced issue.
In Hollywood, when someone's depressed on screen, what you generally see is someone who can't get out of bed in the morning, lays there, looks sad, generally just doesn't interact with the people around them, even loved ones. Is that what people would generally see as symptoms in someone around them that had major depression?
Yeah, that kind of depiction is probably accurate and reflective of some people with major depression. There are other people who have had depression for a long time or get pretty good at managing it, who sometimes look well on the surface, and maybe people would be surprised that they had depression. And so there's a whole range of different ways somebody might look who has depression. You can't just make assumptions just because somebody was able to get into work on time that they don't have depression.
Now, that's an interesting point because here in our sphere, if we want to call it that, there was a recent suicide where it came as quite a shock to a lot of people who knew that person. It turned out the final consensus was that this gentleman was living with major depression, but that he was hiding all of his symptoms. Is that something that people can successfully pull off?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I'm really glad that you brought up suicide because people with depression absolutely have a risk of suicide, and suicidal thoughts and feelings can be one of the symptoms of suicide. Suicide can also be associated with other mental illnesses other than depression, and people can also have suicidal thoughts and feelings if they don't meet criteria for a major mental disorder. So it's a little bit tough to assume after the fact that somebody who's taken their life actually had depression. But just for argument's sake, I would definitely say it is possible that somebody could be depressed under the surface, carry on a sort of brave face, and not share their reality with other people. And sometimes you can see suicide go along with it. And it's very, very, very tragic. And the people left behind wonder if they could have done something to help and feel awful not having had the opportunity to try to help.
So what causes a person to be depressed?
There's a lot of different theories about what actually causes depression. I like to think a little bit about the model that we have for rats and mice with depression. It's not something I necessarily condone in terms of treatment of animals, but when they do experimental models to be able to study depression, they'll sometimes put a small mouse in a bucket of water and let it swim. And there's really no way to get out of the bucket. They just kind of got to swim. And the depressed mice and the depressed rats in this paradigm give up on swimming because they're feeling helpless and they have this sense of helplessness and struggle to go on through that sense of helplessness. And so people talk about the fact that depression can be a form of learned helplessness, that when they try to manage their stress or they try to face some of the things that are, try to reach some of their goals, if it's not going well or they're continually punished for taking actions, then sometimes they might go into a state where they feel lack of motivation to do things. Other people talk about depression as an outcome of distorted or inaccurate thoughts. So if somebody is continually thinking, I'm a worthless person, I'm a worthless person, I'm a worthless person, those kinds of thoughts can actually impact the brain and impact the body and contribute to sort of a depressive state. The bottom line is stress definitely plays a role. The genes the person was born with play a role. There's an interaction there. And for many people, if the demands that they're facing outweigh their resources, some people think that depression is actually a form of self-preservation, kind of a way to slow down and almost hibernate in order to not waste resources needlessly. So there definitely is this mind-body element. Sometimes we'll find even a medical illness or physical stress can trigger a period of depression. So maybe somebody had a serious illness like the flu, had a lot of inflammation in their body as a result of that flu or the illness, and maybe they have a period of 5 or 6 weeks of depression resulting from that. And so everybody's a little bit different and it's a little bit complicated. And as I said, there's mild forms all the way up to very severe forms of depression. So that's why seeking help to understand how severe something is and gauge the level of impact and work on a treatment that everybody can agree upon, whether it includes biological things like medicine or other strategies like psychotherapy or wellness-related strategies. It's always good to get some help on that.
Jumping back a little bit, just to point out a tweet by J.K. Rowling. Her tweet says, "This thread will teach you a lot about the defense mechanism of projection, but zero about the real mental illness." Obviously, we've talked about the real mental illness a little bit. What do you think she means by projection? Is she kind of pointing the finger back at Mr. Tate a little bit there?
Yeah, the idea of projection is kind of a older term that comes from Freud's work and some of his ideas he had about what makes people tick. But that's this idea that if you're uncomfortable with something within yourself, you would maybe tend to put that onto another person, kind of like light is projected onto a screen. You would project your ideas and uncomfortable feelings about yourself onto other people.
That's happened more than once.
Yep, that's a thing.
Okay.
Yeah, right. This is something that happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think J.K. Rowling, in a kind of sophisticated way, is indicating that to make such a strong and accurate statement like that out to the world indicates there might be a little bit more underneath the surface for the person making that statement than maybe that person is aware of.
We did receive a couple of questions from Imgur. We haven't released our first episode yet, but we asked for questions on the Imgur website. The first one kind of addresses what we were already talking about a little bit. This person wants us to talk about anxiety, depression, and laziness. I think they're asking if those things are maybe related.
Yeah, I think that was a very interesting question, and it kind of gets at the idea of people who have severe anxiety or depression and kind of maybe experience that lack of motivation. And that can sometimes be interpreted by oneself or other people as a form of laziness. What I would say in response to that question is it'd be good to sort of figure out what exactly is going on, and maybe you could get some help figuring that out. But if somebody is depressed and not having motivation and lays on the couch, doesn't necessarily make a meal, maybe they just get out some chips and are kind of watching TV and don't turn their attention to the things they normally enjoy doing or the things they need to do, that can be associated with a lot of guilt and shame and negative feelings. And sometimes those negative feelings can actually reinforce a depressive state in kind of a vicious cycle. And so we try to approach these types of issues in a way that's very non-judgmental. So if somebody came in and used the word laziness, I'd probably have them talk about lack of motivation in order to take some of that judgmental tone out of it. Now, does laziness exist on its own? Is laziness a thing? I think we would probably say, yes, there might be an afternoon where I've had a lazy afternoon and I procrastinate some of the things that I wanted to get to and instead watch a movie and eat some popcorn. But if somebody has persistent lack of motivation, lack of pleasure, suicide thoughts, extreme guilt, and are not getting done the things they need to get done, I would probably work to take that word laziness out of the equation.
Okay, our next question is also from Imgur. When do we know when we should seek help for someone with mental issues?
We really think about this in terms of if somebody's functioning or not functioning. So if you're having symptoms of sadness or something happens where you feel some grief about it and it lasts several days and then resolves, or, feeling a variety of feelings during the day, but overall functioning well, meeting your goals, getting done what you need to get done, generally managing stress, you may think about pursuing wellness-related activities in order to keep doing that or improve your skills at doing that. But you might not necessarily need help for a mental illness or a psychiatric disorder. Where you would consider something like that is when what we say functioning is impaired. So you're not meeting your goals, you're not doing the things you'd normally want to do. Things that used to be easy for you are much more difficult now. That's when we really want to make sure that you get the help that you need so that you can continue at the level of functioning that's right for you.
Okay, Dr. Kaz, anything else you want to say about depression before we close it out here?
Yeah, over the coming episodes, we'll have lots of opportunities to talk about depression. I think the main idea to leave with is that depression is not simply equivalent to sadness or distress. It's a full set of symptoms that cause significant and serious dysfunction. And so if we can be on the same page about that, our future conversations will make a lot more sense.
Great.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us today. This podcast was produced by Kaz and George. Music by Paul.
He's the best.
Contact us and send us your questions on Twitter @MindDeconstruct.